Good evening. Welcome to this evening's edition of Tysky Sour. We're going every night this week. My name's Aaron Bastani. I have the great pleasure of being joined once more by Michael Walker. How you doing, Michael?
I'm very well. I'm getting used to the lockdown we're under. I kind of like that at the end of the day now. I used to feel a little bit ashamed if I hadn't left the house at the end of the day. I'd have thought, I should have at least, gone and done some exercise or like gone and done some work in a library or whatever. But now, if you get to the end of the day and you haven't left the house, that's an achievement. So I feel like I'm flourishing in this particular in these demands that have been placed on us all over the coming days.
You're an overachiever. You don't leave the house.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm fucking great at this. Yeah.
We'll be talking tonight about who is the worst boss in Britain. Is it Mike Ashley or is it Tim Martin? Two egregious examples of how the boss class are behaving appallingly in response to the COVID-19 crisis. We'll be talking how that relates to a crisis of British high streets. And then we'll move on to talk about, among other things, a potential debt crisis that's heading our way, particularly in the global south over the next couple of months. And then we'll go to questions after that. Michael, last night, the government gave us advice about people that go to work in key sectors. What would you think constitute key sectors in the government's mind?
In the government's mind, or in the commonsensical mind? Whose mind do you want me to enter into at this point in time?
It's an increasingly ambiguous line, but when they say,
if I was to get into the government's line, I would say it would be all the people who can go to work without there being a social media fuss. Right. Well, I mean, that's what it seemed to be, right? You had today, you had people going to work on construction sites. You still have people going to work in non-essential businesses in offices. We're going to talk about it a bit more in detail later. But basically, the government claim that you should only leave the house to go to work if you absolutely need to has turned into you should only leave the house and go to work if your boss wants you to. Very different things, really. But we'll get onto that, I suppose.
I mean, for me, key workers would be supermarket workers, people that work in pharmacists, electricians, maybe if there's a call out, public sector workers like nurses, police officers. But I certainly wouldn't be thinking of employees of Sports Direct. How about you, Michael?
Oh, well, Aaron, the thing is, this would be Mike Ashley's argument. The government have told us to go for runs, and people need to buy their trainers and cut price Calvin Klein's.
When you heard the argument, what did you think? I kind of thought, you know what, he's got a point. I've been trying to emergency buy kettlebells at Decathlon. They have none left. I mean, maybe he has a point.
I mean, he's a fucking chancellor, isn't he?
I don't
know. He might have that whole, any publicity is good publicity vibe. Because I mean, he seems to jump on whatever is like in the news cycle at that point in time and like go hell for leather. And we're going to come up to it, but it's not just he said that his businesses are the only, or not the only, but his businesses are essential. They have to stay open even in the middle of a global pandemic in case people want to buy water bottles or whatever, drawstring bags.
Well,
he's also raising the price. He's price gouging, skipping ropes. So yeah, this guy is pretty goddamn scummy.
He was obviously the announcement. We went live last night at 9 p.m. Pretty much straight after Boris Johnson's announcement. Within 30 minutes of that decision to shut down all non-essential retailers, Mike Ashley's Frasers Group sent an email basically telling staff that they would go to work as usual. They backtracked this morning, but they suggested they might get the go-ahead from government and that they were hoping that the decision would be subject to review. We're now going to go to a clip with Michael Gove on the BBC this morning, who made pretty clear that, believe it or not, Sports Direct don't constitute essential services. Let's go to that clip.
Lots of our viewers get in contact today asking about Mike Ashley's decision to keep Sports Direct open. Are they essential? Are you going to ask them to change that?
Sports Direct is not essential. I hope they will change that, yes.
What sort of pressure can the government put on them to make sure that they do close?
We'll be talking to everyone affected, but it is clear to me that Sports Direct is not essential retail.
Is it clear to you, Michael, after watching that clip? I mean, he still says advice, right? That's the worry. It's not quite, again, it's not that clear, even now.
to be fair to him, Michael Gove was quite clear in that clip, wasn't he? He was saying that this is not essential advice. But I mean, it does seem like, well, at least those Sports Direct shops weren't open today. I understand that Mike Ashley did get people to turn up to them, and they were, shifting stock around because presumably they're going to go online at this time. I want to get up some of the price gouging, price changes though. So you can go to the Sports Direct price increases. A Lonsdale Club skipping rope, and this is from yesterday to today. So literally, when the announcement came from Boris Johnson, skipping ropes went from $2.99 to $4.99 at Sports Direct. Hand weights, what even is a 1 kilogram hand weight? Something you run with? They went from $3.99 to $5.99. Everlast kettlebells have gone up 50% from a tenner to 15 quid.
Yeah.
So this really is a shameless guy who presumably, actually, it's not just he thought his business. This wasn't just I want to stay open during the coronavirus crisis. It was presumably I want to take absolute advantage of this coronavirus crisis and be one of the few shops on the high street that's open. He probably saw it just as a moment to crush the competition.
I mean, there are some businesses that are doing extraordinarily well out of the crisis, right? So you've got Tesco. You have there's a bunch of Logitech webcams. You can't find a webcam for love or money, as we found out at Novara Media. But there may also be a bit more of a structural explanation for his very odd behavior. We can cut to a graph basically showing Mike Ashley's personal wealth over the last couple of months. It's kind of indexed to the Frasers Group. I think he owns about 65% of the company, and you can basically see it falling by about 65% in the last couple of months. Since 20th of February, the value of Frasers Group, owner of Sports Direct, has fallen by 1.4 billion, which translates to a paper loss of 840 million for Ashley. So maybe Mike Ashley's got no choice. I mean, maybe this is the end of the Mike Ashley empire unless they really go balls to the wall. What do you think of that hypothesis?
Well, they've still got an online shop, right? I imagine what this crisis is going to do is massively boost people's, because I suppose one of the reasons why high streets, they're already struggling, but they still have some business. And the reason they still have some business is probably the habits of potentially older generations. And what coronavirus is going to do is get everyone into the habit of getting all their goods delivered. So this could quite clearly be the death knell to Britain's retail sector.
I mean, we've got a few more.
Doesn't mean you should stay open in the middle of a global pandemic and try and profit off skipping ropes in a time of quarantine. But there is a bit of a structural explanation for quite bad behaviour from certain retail chains, right? We'll talk about Tim Martin in a second, because obviously JD Wetherspoon has done outstandingly well over the last couple of years. Massive expansion. Maybe folks can bring up some of these graphics. You've got obviously Beals and Debenhams went into administration earlier this year. John Lewis has had to close certain stores. M&S as well. 2019, according to The Guardian, was the worst ever year for UK retailers. And so I think perhaps some of this shitty behavior can be explained by structural factors. And I think with so much else, I think what we're going to see with COVID-19 is that, yes, of course, it's a historic event in its own right, but it's going to intensify and accentuate pre-existing tendencies, one of which is the demise of the UK high street. I think this is the last nail in the coffin for businesses like Debenhams, possibly like Sports Direct. I know what you're saying about online retail, Michael, but with these kind of more discounty sort of stores like Sports Direct, what's their niche? Marks and Spencer with their clothes off. It's very much offline. It's very much an older kind of consumer. What's their niche? I'm not so sure. And so I think there's a bit of desperation coming in here. Look, I'm not trying to make excuses for Mike Ashley. He's clearly a comedy bad guy. He's appalling. But I do think it speaks to something about the demise of a potential retail model in this country. I suppose the niche of sport, I mean, this is now just getting into marketing chat, not really politics, but I mean, the niche of Sports Direct or JD Sports or whatever is that Amazon is the other thing that you get delivered from, and you can never tell if what you're buying is real because they just let anything get sold on their website, right?
Yeah. Let's go to, I think, definitely a worse case if we're talking about challenges faced by UK business in a world of COVID-19. We've got Tim Martin, CEO of JD Wetherspoons. We can get up a letter that was sent from, I think it was the Bakers Union, wasn't it? The Bakers Union with the spoon strike, basically organised workers who work at JD Wetherspoons. No payout from Wetherspoons. After waiting for 3 days for word from our head office, today we were informed that the company would pay us only for the hours we have worked up until 22nd of March. From that point on, we will not receive any payment from JD Wetherspoons until they receive the government grant, which could be until the end of April. While other companies such as Costa have promised their staff 8 weeks fully paid, which is surprisingly good, Wetherspoons have left over 40,000 people, wow, without their next pay date, with no means of paying for rent, bills, or food, and with no warning. Employees have been stripped of bonuses we had already achieved, and with no confirmation as to how 80% of pay from the government will be calculated. Rather, which we'll go on to see in a video circulated to all staff from the company's CEO, Tim Martin encouraged his staff to apply for Tesco's, jobs at Tesco. It is clear that Wetherspoons hold no regard for the financial and mental well-being of their employees. We demand full pay. Let's go to that video of Tim Martin. He shot it in his house. He seemed to be a little bit inebriated. We're going to go to the final 30 seconds of that video.
If you're offered a job at a supermarket, many of you will want to do that. If you think it's a good idea, do it. I can completely understand it. If you've worked for us before, I promise you we'll give you first preference if you want to come back, and we'll all obviously completely understand that you don't want to wait around for us to reopen.
What did you make of that, Michael? Do you think he had a few drinks?
I mean, he always seems pissed, doesn't he? Which I suppose, I mean, maybe he's a walking advert for his pub because he always seems pissed. He's always talking nonsense, but he always does seem cheerful enough. Presumably the people watching that video were less cheerful because they were being told that they were going to get laid off, essentially. Well, they're going to get put to gardening leave, and they're not going to get any pay until, you know, the check actually comes from the government. And so the reason that Wetherspoon staff are pissed off is because, you know, what lots of companies are doing and what the Wetherspoons boss should be doing is covering those wages from day one, and then waiting for the government to, you know, to pay that back when they sort out their own bureaucracy. Because obviously, if we're looking at, you know, liquidity, so the argument that the Wetherspoons, well, that Tim Martin's making is that, you know, I can't pay you your wages until the check has come from the government, because otherwise, you know, I'd go bankrupt or whatever. But he can borrow money. We know that interest rates are historically low at the moment. We know that Wetherspoons has a turnover of £1.8 billion. So if he thinks he's having a cash squeeze, imagine what his staff are going through, right? So he is the guy who should be covering the pay for the time in between that which it takes the government to announce their 80% worker retention scheme and the time at which they can actually be sending out the cash.
I mean, also, I think he's on a salary of about £340,000 a year. Obviously, has a great deal of equity in the business. But do you think it's a mistake to look at people like Richard Branson, Tim Martin, Mike Ashley, and say, look, these are the failures of sort of the British model of capitalism? Because just as easily somebody can point to Gary Neville, or they can point to Costa Coffee and say, well, look, they're looking after their employees. It doesn't have to be like this. Or do you think there's room for a more structural argument, which says, actually, you have to be this exploitative, you have to be this ruthless to succeed in an economy which is based on low wages, low productivity, and very flexible, easy labour markets?
Well, I think in terms of this particular exceptional moment, the difference between Costa and Wetherspoons, I don't think is structural. So Costa have said we'll pay from day one our staff full pay actually for at least 8 weeks. So they're assuming that the government is going to reimburse them for 80% of that amount or on their worker retention scheme, and they're going to top it up. Tim Martin said he's not going to top it up. Now, Tim Martin's decision not to pay people immediately and top up their wages to 100%, I don't think it's going to have a particularly large impact on Wetherspoon's accounts. That just seems like he doesn't, you know, he has an attitude which is that he's going to do the bare minimum. I was also, I mean, I shouldn't say this because this is making Wetherspoons look good. But I was wondering if the difference between why Tim Martin is so, you know, chilled about becoming a public hate figure is because he knows that he does sell cheaper beer than everyone else on the high street, whereas Costa is a shit service. It's like the coffee's more expensive and it doesn't, you know, and it's worse. It's always milky. So I mean, maybe Costa are thinking they can't afford bad PR, because then people will stop going there. Maybe it could be a sign of Wetherspoon's strength that this guy feels like he could be such an asshole publicly.
Well, there's actually perhaps even more evidence of that. We're going to go to a clip from actually less than 7 days ago, less than a week ago, where Tim Martin is saying that pubs should stay open and that there's been very low rates of transmission in them.
Our aim is for pubs open for the duration. This could go on for a long time. And I think that once you shut them down, it's very difficult. Supermarkets are very, very crowded. Pubs are much less crowded. There's hardly been any transmission of the virus within pubs. And I think it's over the top to shut them. That's a commercial view, but I think it's also a common sense view.
Yeah, maybe the less said about him, the better. Mike, you said on the show last night, someone mentioned that in terms of people going to work, the lockdown hadn't really changed very much.
Yep.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so let's go through some of that. We can go through some tweets and some images. So obviously, it's also worth mentioning that obviously there is no evidence that people did not catch coronavirus in Tim Martin's pubs. It's just complete and utter nonsense. But in any case, let's go back to this morning, and especially on the tubes. There was still a rush hour, as I said earlier. I assumed actually that when Boris Johnson made that big dramatic announcement, there was going to be significant measures to make sure that not as many people had to go to work on Tuesday as had to go to work yesterday on Monday. And that doesn't seem to have been the case. To begin with, the government's messaging on this was incredibly confused. It was changing from 1 hour to the next. So we can look at a tweet which was sent out by the government at around 9 p.m. And in this tweet, they said, amongst the reasons that one would be able to leave the house, they said, go to work if you're a key worker. Okay, that's sensible. That's what I assumed when Boris Johnson had made that announcement. I was like, that's a good policy. Then an hour later, either some phone calls were made, well, to tell the social media guy that he got it wrong, or some phone calls were made to say that if you only let key workers go into work tomorrow, there's going to be some damage to the profit margins of, for example, property developers. But in any case, the advice changed to this. So you may leave the house to go to work, but work from home if possible. Which is like the weakest, instruction I think they could have possibly mustered. And the implications of that are pretty clear. So if it wasn't obvious enough at this point, when they'd updated that tweet that the government were prioritizing profits over public safety, we can go to a tweet from Robert Jenrick, who is the community secretary. So he said last night, if you're working on site, you can continue to do. He was saying how this applies to construction industries is basically you can continue. And if you are working on site, you can continue to do so, but follow Public Health England guidance on social distancing. So he's basically giving carte blanche permission for building sites to continue functioning. Not only is it pretty difficult to work on a building site all day whilst never coming in, 2-meter proximity of your workmates. But however safe you are in your work environment, you've still got to get there, which is precisely why you saw full tubes at rush hour this morning. So we can go to another image of rush hour this morning. Looked a lot like rush hour yesterday. And we're also going to show it in the context of a Daily Mail headline. So obviously they are blaming the people on the train. They're trying to shame people. Why are these people on the train at rush hour, given that it's a lockdown? Maybe you should ask their bosses, because it's the bosses that made them turn up. And the government were also quite clear today that said if your boss tells you to go to work, you have to go to work unless you've got symptoms. So people have been put in a very difficult situation here. If you want to look at what it looked like on construction sites today, there's also a tweet here by Dan Dobson. We showed one of his yesterday. So this is a construction site in Middlesbrough. He also had a little video of people who had to, you got into the construction site by putting your finger on a little machine, to check your identity. And then it also had a sign saying, sorry, we're out of alcohol scrub. So the idea, it's all on the video. It's in the same thread as that particular tweet. So this idea that health and safety protocols are being followed to the highest degree is bullshit. And even if they were, people still have to get the underground to work alongside a bunch of health workers who are, at this point in time, given they've got shit PPE, shit protective equipment, quite likely to have coronavirus. And even if they weren't, they're exactly the kind of people we don't want to get coronavirus, because that's going to, significantly, damage our ability to respond to, the flurry of cases that are going to be going into our hospitals over the next 3 weeks. So it all just seems nonsense.
I was listening to Radio 4 earlier on, and it's not just the advice in regards to work, which is very ambiguous. So obviously, maybe we can bring that graphic up again, Fox. Sorry about this. In regards to the government's new instructions, you could leave the house once a day to do exercise. And there was, it says here, to exercise outside once a day, parentheses. There was Claire Gerarda. I think she was formerly with the British Medical Association. Is that right? It was the BMA. Was she with Michael?
I don't know who we're talking about.
She's a very senior sort of, medical practitioner in Britain, a bit of a name. And then I think Jeremy Vine was saying, well, what if you only go out once for 10 minutes or you go out twice for 10 minutes? Is that the same as going out once for an hour? If I go out once to exercise, but I go for a 6-hour run, and then, basically there was a consensus, and this is on BBC Radio 4. Look, this is being, broadcast to millions of people. They said, you should probably just exercise personal discretion. You say that's absolutely not what should be happening. The government is meant to be enforcing. You're sort of shaking your head, but the point is discretion.
Yeah, no, I think in that case, I mean, apart from the work stuff.
But it's like a boss could exercise discretion then, because then Mike Ashley can say, well, in my personal discretion, I think that Sports Direct workers are, essential workers. Surely it's public health and safety. Sure, it's not about personal discretion. It's about somebody in full receipt of the facts with a plan, saying, actually, you need to do this and coordinate accordingly.
There's two issues as to why it's different. So one is that in a public health crisis, you want to allow people to feel you want people to have control over how safe they feel, right? So if someone doesn't want to go out into the street during a pandemic, they should be able to stay at home, exceptional circumstances. But the other one is a practical one, right? So when you get those radio phone-ins and someone's, quite reasonably asking, what if I want to go for a run in the morning and then a run in the evening instead of one long run? The issue is that as long as they're not going, hanging out in groups of friends or going on the tube at rush hour, it doesn't really matter. The problem with Mike Ashley telling people to go to work is they're going to be working together inside for a long period of time, and their workers are going to travel there on rush hour. So I think so long as what you're doing is pretty low risk, using your own discretion is fine. And I do think that Boris Johnson's lockdown announcement obviously signaled that people should socially distance to a much more it was much more effective than anything he said before that. So I don't mind the whole discretion thing when it comes to jogs or going to the corner shop.
Okay, well, that's enough about discretion, Mike Ashley, Tim Martin. We're going to talk about a pretty minor story, Michael. You might have heard about this. The government just ended homelessness in London. Kind of a big deal.
Seems like a good idea.
It seems.
You wonder why we didn't do it earlier, eh?
Yeah, this is on the BBC website. If we can just pull this up, Fox. This is from several days ago. This is part of broader nationally coordinated action in regards to helping rough sleepers. I think right now the Mayor's office is helping about 300 rough sleepers in London. They're getting hotel rooms. Hotel beds have been offered to rough sleepers in London to help protect them against coronavirus. About 300 rooms were made available this weekend to vulnerable people already known to homelessness charities as part of an initial trial. London Mayor Sadiq Khan's office is working with Intercontinental Hotels Group to block book rooms at a discounted rate for the next 12 weeks. It's not just London. In fact, we're moving into a national plan to get rough sleepers off the streets entirely. This is from The Guardian. Hotels and offices will be converted into emergency safe spaces under a national action plan drawn up by Tony Blair's former homelessness expert to protect rough sleepers from coronavirus. Louise Casey, hired by Boris Johnson last month over the issue of homelessness, was scheduled to start her role after Easter, but deepening disquiet that the government was sleepwalking on homeless people's vulnerability to COVID-19 led her to being drafted in to spearhead its response. I think this is kind of an important thing to talk about, Michael, because, I've got Fox, by the way, telling me I've got apparently a volume issue. I'm either too loud or too quiet. There's literally one dial between the two. So we'll have to have me too loud for today. But it was one thing I found quite interesting was it's one of those political issues where coronavirus, COVID-19 has just kind of revealed how politically contingent things like rough sleeping are. We saw rough sleeping in the last 10 years triple, quadruple in London. Homelessness and rough sleeping, it's important to say, are different things. Homelessness can affect people who are couch surfing, etc., people in temporary accommodation, but rough sleeping is what you visibly see, people living on streets. And people would respond, particularly apologists for the government, well, we haven't got the money to resolve this. And actually, it turns out in a public health crisis, in the context of a pandemic, it can be resolved in a matter of possibly weeks. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, street homelessness was always, this has always been admitted, by shelter, by charities, etc. That street homelessness is actually quite easy to end, right? What do you do to solve street homelessness? You give people houses, and this has been, it sounds stupidly simple, but it's been trialed in American states, Finland, I think, where they've said that actually it can save the state money to give someone a flat, because the model we have, in our sort of moralizing welfare state, is you assume that someone, because they've become homeless, has has made some sort of moral error, and so the agencies of the state have to go out and say, oh, are you on the street because you're addicted? We should make you not addicted to drugs, and then we might consider giving you housing benefit or whatever. And what they decided in Finland, and I can't remember precisely what American state it was, potentially Colorado. They said, actually, maybe these people aren't homeless because they're addicts. Maybe they're addicts because they're homeless. Because it's obviously very difficult to get yourself together if you don't have anywhere to sleep and anywhere to live. It's very difficult to get a job, to sort your life out if you're sleeping on the street. So they gave homeless people flats, and then they found, oh, actually, yeah, people function pretty well when you put them in a house. And obviously, that's not what's gone on here. This is just people getting a hotel room for a while. But I would hope that this moment makes people, one, realize that it's incredibly possible to end rough sleeping at the drop of a hat if there is some political will to do so. But also, I mean, when we get to the end of this, I mean, presumably they're going to want to, stagger it and do it very quietly. But the moment at which they evict all of the country's rough sleepers and say, oh, actually, coronavirus crisis is over now. Here's your sleeping bag back. I mean, well, let's hope we can make that politically difficult for the government, because it's inexcusable that we've allowed this many people to live on Britain's streets, and it's been increasing for the last 10 years for so long.
And the point you make about actually how this possibly even costs the taxpayer money, this arrangement, I think is a really important one. Look, we shouldn't be saying the reason why you would do it is to save money, because obviously we believe in the universal dignity of human beings, and everybody should have shelter and the basic goods to live lives of dignity, including housing, including shelter, healthcare. But I think it's quite a persuasive argument. There was a line once from John Edwards, of all people, in 2004. He was running for the Democratic nomination for US president. He said it's cheaper to send a man to, he was being a bit of a sexist, but whatever. It's cheaper to send a man to Yale than to jail. And I think it's the same in regards to long-term homelessness. It's probably cheaper to give somebody affordable accommodation than have to constantly police their homeless kind of issues, potentially deal with substance abuse issues and whatnot. So I think something to think about. If we can actually bring up that example, because you mentioned Finland a bit earlier on, Michael, but Helsinki's doing something quite similar to what we should be doing here. I think they've reduced rough sleeping by 35%. It's the only country in the European Union where rough sleep is actually falling, and it's a pretty simple solution, which is give people homes. And like you say, not rocket science. We have 1,486 people watching, only 624 likes. Smash the like button. If you've not already, smash the subscribe button. We're going every night this week. We might not have the energy to do that forever. Regularly, we go Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We have our morning podcast, The Burner. The second one was out this morning. It's now got its own exclusive iTunes feed. So go to the Novara Media iTunes account. You'll see all our other podcasts. But if you go to iTunes and search The Burner Novara, that'll come up too. That's hosted by James Butler every morning. It's a brilliant dose of 10 minutes of news, current affairs, and all things related to, not just coronavirus, but a political kind of crisis, which is so multidimensional, which is what this story is all about. We are going to go to the final story before we go to questions. By the way, if you want to ask any questions, ask questions on Twitter under the hashtag TiskiSour. If you want to share this show, the show is in the description. There's a link. And also ask questions in the comments with a rocket emoji. The final part of the show is... Go on, Mike.
I was just going to say, it was Toronto. So it wasn't an American state that trialed this. They call it a housing first policy. It was Toronto in Canada.
Makes sense.
And they found that it was cheaper and more effective.
Makes sense. I mean, there is also the added incentive with countries like Canada or Finland to get rid of homelessness, in so much as Helsinki has minus 30 degrees C, I guess. It's kind of a bit of it's basically a death sentence if people are rough sleeping. Final part of the show, we're talking about a developing world debt crisis. According to IMF director or acting director Juliana Kristeva, investors have already removed $83 billion, $83 billion from emerging markets since the start of the COVID-19 crisis. This is the largest capital outflow ever recorded. We get this graphic up from Al Jazeera. The IMF is basically now predicting a global recession. I mean, that's probably not news to most people, but it's significant. The last one was in 2008-9. And basically, this is a problem for a bunch of lower income countries because, as I'm sure many people are aware, if you go out, if you drive, and you're looking at petrol prices right now, they are crazy low. And so this dual face problem, this Janus face problem of low oil prices and COVID-19, particularly difficult for countries like Iran, Iraq, Libya, and then other countries elsewhere in that region, Saudi Arabia. So for all the countries in North Africa, West Asia, what we might historically call the Middle East, relatively weak state institutions in many cases, been subject to war in many cases, been subject to US imperialism in many cases. But now the kind of coup de grace is this, like I say, this twin challenge of low oil prices. Often these are the single greatest source of state revenues, and the challenges of a public health crisis. Of course, Iran has been one of the most significantly affected countries in regards to COVID-19. And I think the reason why I raised this, Mike, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. The reason why I raised this is just like with the high streets issue. This has been a long time in the making. You know, we've been seeing, for instance, the US will be leaving Afghanistan, I think, in about 18 months. That's the plan anyway. The Iraqi government's asked the United States to leave Iraq. They've not yet done it. They asked them after, of course, the execution of Qasem Soleimani, an senior Iranian military officer. And it seems to me that this kind of perfect storm of COVID-19, falling oil revenues, and actually an increasingly assertive, prominent China. Do you think we could be seeing a quite big geopolitical shift in the next 5 years? And could COVID-19 be the single biggest catalyst and maybe changing some regimes, but also what countries look to as the sort of leading regional hegemon?
Yeah, I mean, the geopolitics of I mean, we talked yesterday about what the political outcomes of coronavirus will be in terms of, is it seen as an example as to why you should have more state intervention and why, we could have a more egalitarian society with greater state capacity, as we have had, during this crisis, and maybe keep some of it. Or, it might happen just like after 2008, where the government or the political right are basically saying, oh, we spent loads of money, so now we have to cut entitlements to the poor so we can save it back again. There's going to be a similar battle geopolitically. So obviously, coronavirus is a fairly unique phenomenon when it comes to geopolitics, because the virus itself emerged in a part of China, in Wuhan, but also the country which has been most effective on a global level of supporting countries to resist the spread of coronavirus and to deal with it has been China. So you've seen China sending tons of doctors even over to Italy, but also medical equipment. And when European solidarity, for example, seems to be breaking down over COVID-19, in terms of monetary policy, a bit they're doing a bit better than they were in the 2010s. But when it comes to direct medical supplies, I think at least Germany have been pretty much like we're not exporting ventilators in this period of time because we're prioritizing our own people. And it only seems to be really China who are seriously providing the goods that people need. But in terms of the debt crisis that you're talking about, though, this is almost like the last gasp of the previous system, because it's the same situation again, where a global crisis, whatever form it takes, tends to hit developing countries harder because they're less resilient to this kind of thing, because they have a dependent system, a dependent position in global financial markets. And I suppose the most obvious way of thinking about this is when you look at the UK or the United States, and they have this massive exogenous crisis that's hit them, in this case, coronavirus. What is the thing that those governments do? They say, we are going to borrow shed loads of money and we are going to splurge it to make sure that the economy survives this. Yeah. And the reason they can do that, the reason that the UK and the US can do that is that interest rates are historically low. On global financial markets, even if a risk has emerged in the United States, as it did in 2008, people buy the dollar because you see security in the dollar, and that is not the kind of privilege or good fortune. Obviously, it's not down to luck that many developing countries have. So when an exogenous crisis happens and you need to spend a bit more money, it's difficult to borrow that. You might have to borrow it, at extortionate rates on financial markets, or you might have to accept it from a global financial institution like the IMF or the World Bank. And historically, what they have tied to their loans are pretty, harsh structural adjustment reforms, which have often made economies more vulnerable in the long run. And it is worth noting, actually, I saw today there was a speech made by the World Bank president, not a speech, it was a sort of address to a meeting of the G20 about a response to COVID-19. It was a meeting online, obviously, because of the health problems with meeting in person. And we can get a couple of quotes from that to show that actually, even in this global health pandemic, structural adjustment reforms are going to be potentially pushed upon developing countries if they want support to survive the next months and years. So we'll just get a couple of quotes. These are difficult times for all, especially for the poorest and most vulnerable. This is the president of the World Bank. For the World Bank Group, our first goal is to provide prompt support during the crisis based on a country's needs. It's also vital to shorten the time to recovery and create confidence that the recovery can be strong. And then buried in the address, a few paragraphs down, he says, countries will need to implement structural reforms to help shorten the time to recovery and create confidence that the recovery can be strong. For those countries that have excessive regulations, subsidies, licensing regimes, trade protection, or litigiousness as obstacles, we will work with them to foster markets, choice, and faster growth prospects during the recovery. So just as countries like Britain are recognizing that maybe we need to have the kind of industrial capacity, which means we can urgently ramp up the production of ventilators. And that might mean that, we have to have some, at least state aid for these industries. We can't just say, oh, we won't have any strategy. We'll just buy it from the cheapest seller abroad. When many countries in the West are realizing, oh, we have to build up the kind of state capacity that means we can deal with a crisis. And that means big government. The World Bank is still telling developing countries that, oh, if you want to recover from this particular crisis, you've got to shrink your government, you've got to shrink regulation, and you've got to open up your economy to even more free trade.
Do you think it's possible to see a repeat of what happened after 2008-9 when a financial crisis became a crisis of sovereign debt? And so you may see a number of countries in 2 or 3 years' time, people have forgotten about COVID-19. And, some countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, will have GDP to debt ratios of 300-400%, maybe even some countries in the global north. We saw that with Greece, for instance, after the 2008-9 crisis. This also holds for countries in the Eurozone because, like you say, it's not just countries in the global south which can't issue new currency to pay their way out of a crisis in the manner that, say, Britain or the US can. Countries within the Eurozone, relatively less powerful countries than, say, France or Germany, have similar issues. Do you think we might see sort of austerity as the solution after sovereign debt crises because of COVID-19? Or have we?
Well, it depends.
We've had that for 12 years, haven't we? Or do you think people would just be fed the same line?
Well, I suppose, the austerity that came after the 2008 crisis was especially in, the global north, right? And that, whether or not austerity is a response to coronavirus in places like the UK. I mean, we spoke about yesterday. We think, I think it's probably less likely that is going to be the political outcome of this as compared to 2008, but it's a political unknown. When it comes to countries in the global south that might find themselves indebted due to the measures they have to take or the loans they have to get to pay their way through this crisis, it's too early to say. And what we might see is that whereas in previous debt crises, the IMF and the World Bank had to bail, were the only option for countries to deal with debt crises, and then all of the structural adjustment policies were imposed as a result, which often came with them, austerity, as you say. This could be the perfect opportunity for China to step in, and suddenly, if the World Bank and IMF are saying to these countries, you can have a loan from us, but only if you shrink back the state, and China's saying, well, we'll give you a loan and you don't have to shrink back the state. I mean, that could be a massive moment for a geopolitical pivot.
So there's lots of space here for China basically filling a vacuum, not just left by the United States, but also the IMF, the World Bank. Something that's already happening in Africa, actually. A lot of big infrastructural projects in Africa these days are being funded by Chinese capital. One more thing I wanted to say as well is that the levels of sort of international solidarity weren't just coming from the Chinese state. I don't know if you saw Jack Ma CEO of Alibaba. I think he's sending like a couple of hundred face masks to Europe, and you think, wow, this is one billionaire. Compare that to Elon Musk, who tweeted like a couple of weeks ago, "Hey, coronavirus isn't that big a deal," and you're seeing a shift in global leadership, not just within nation states, but also their kind of leading domestic elites. We're going to go to questions. Put them in the comments with rocket emoji, also on the hashtag #TSKSAR, and Fox can curate them. We have 1,557 watching, 866 likes. Smash the like button, very much appreciated. Michael, I think you should do a video about the debt crisis aspect. I hadn't read that World Bank report. That's just crazy about the structural adjustment programs. Kind of complete rerun of stuff we've seen for 30 years. It kind of sounds very retro that they're still saying the same old stuff.
I mean, it is really retro, isn't it? I mean, I only saw it on Twitter today. I mean, we'll have to see how that develops. But I mean, and it could be the case that that maybe these countries won't take loans if they are tied to that sort of conditionality, because potentially China will step in. And I mean, I suppose China is going to be worrying that they've got to, their economy has slowed down significantly because of this particular crisis. Obviously, they had to shut down the economy of an entire region for a significant period of time. But we know that they do, they've got a lot of dollars, right?
Okay, here's a question for you, Michael. Should Labour join the government in a, quote, COVID coalition?
Probably not. I say probably not. I mean, no, not at this point in time. I mean, there is, we've spoken about this before to the extent that the government, there hasn't been nearly enough scrutiny of. Well, I suppose we can put this another way. At this point in time, they might as well, because they're not doing anything else. Ideally, what you want during this crisis is an opposition who's going to be fairly loud in holding the government to account and scrutinising all the decisions they make, and giving voice to ordinary people. As we've spoken about, Labour have been fairly absent during this crisis. I mean, there've been a couple of good policy announcements, a couple of good tweet threads from various leadership candidates, but I haven't felt that the Labour Party have been particularly present, especially when it came to that herd immunity nonsense. To be honest, I don't think they've really held the government to account in terms of the scientific advice they're following and the decisions they're making in that respect.
So you don't think they should? You don't think they should, or should they?
I think they probably. I think they should start scrutinising the government properly and start being a proper opposition instead of joining a coalition government.
Well, if the Tories, let's say the Tories have some inside data that says, look, this may end up being as bad as Italy. I hope it doesn't. I think it probably won't, because we had a few more weeks on them. But let's say that did, then it would make sense from a political perspective for the Tories, but also from technically administering a response politically, to actually invite Labour people to join the cabinet. I mean, that's. I don't think it's possible. I don't think it's probable. I think it's plausible in the worst case scenario. If that were to happen, if those invitations were extended, do you think Labour politicians should outright reject them?
It's really difficult to say. Probably. I also don't think it's. I mean, you have to think with the Second World War, that was like a 4-year project, and we've got no idea whether this coronavirus crisis is going to last 3 months or 2 years. So I feel like it would be, a bit odd for the Conservatives at this point in time to ask for a coalition government. I'd find it very surprising, even though it is being floated by some. I saw some people on Twitter today suggesting that maybe the reason why Keir Starmer has been so tame is that he doesn't want to burn any bridges. And for if he is invited into this coalition government, I mean, the comparison, I suppose, is that was the Labour Tory coalition government that we can refer to, which was during the Second World War, and you could say that the Conservatives then were using Labour's participation to try and shield themselves from the blame if any mistakes were made. But at the same time, I think Labour's participation in that government did put them in a pretty good position to enter power immediately after the war and implement, the most ambitious Labour programme, we've seen, right? I don't really think, the political economic situation is right for that to happen right now. But it's an interesting question. What do you think? Would you go into coalition?
No, and I think any Labour MPs that did that in a way that was maybe analogous to Ramsay MacDonald and several Labour MPs joining the Tories, after the Wall Street crash, which is another analog of a coalition government responding to a national crisis. I think that would be a very dangerous thing to do. Of course, if things got far worse, if we had a situation which was far worse than Italy, at the moment that seems entirely implausible, then maybe that would be subject to change. But no, I think the Tories have a big majority. They shouldn't have any problem in terms of administering an emergency response to a crisis of this scale. We've got a question from Phil B. Michael, do you think this crisis will burst the housing bubble?
Oof. I've got no idea, to be honest. I don't know.
It's a really good question.
I haven't really read anything about it yet.
Well, because my dad was saying, well, look, he was saying to me, he said, surely it's going to happen because in 2008 we had a economic crash, house prices went down. And I was like, well, that was because there was a crisis of the US mortgage market, and actually there were loads of defaults and loads of people were over leveraged. They didn't have the capacity to pay back the debts. There were lots of bad debts. That might be the case this time. I mean, we don't know. But the point is, this is a different kind of crisis. It's been catalyzed, as we've said before, an exogenous shock. Exogenous means outside. That is to say, it's not a dynamic internal within, market capitalism. Another example of an exogenous shock was the 1970s oil crisis. This is an exogenous shock. And so, I mean, I don't know. I mean, the supply of housing is not changing. House builders aren't building new houses. There are more people, if anything, you'd expect it to be static. But then I guess it's perfectly possible that the impact it has on the real economy, people not being able to go to work, people not being able to earn wages, then you might get a higher rate of default. At which point, then you could have something resembling a financial crisis. But right now, we've got an economic crisis and a public health crisis. What's interesting is it kind of inverts what happened in 2008. In 2008, we had a crisis of the financial system, and that became a crisis more broadly of the sort of economic system. You had a contraction of global trade, you had unemployment go up, etc. This time round, what they're trying to do is actually insulate the financial system, the market values of FTSE 100 companies, from a collapse of the real economy. And the collapse of the real economy is entirely intentional. People are being told, do not go to work, do not buy things. So it's an interesting one because, like you say, I've not really read anything about it, and I don't think anybody could give a really authoritative answer.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the government's intention here seems to be to freeze everything, to freeze the economy for the next 6 months, print a load of money, so that no one goes bankrupt, or so that very few people go bankrupt, and then restart again once this is all over. And if they're successful in doing that, then I don't see why house prices wouldn't stay at a similar level to what they are now. As you say, the 2008 crisis was, in large part grew out of a housing bubble, and this crisis certainly hasn't.
Well, it's important to say, I think the IMF, I don't know about the data at the moment, but the IMF had a couple of years ago British housing assets, overvalued by like 15-20%. That said, things have been quite sort of static since 2016, since Brexit. So maybe that's less of an issue now. We've got one more question. We'll take a couple more questions. This is from Ultrasonic Sound. They ask, if it's as bad as Italy, that's to say the COVID-19 crisis in Britain with the death toll and so on, Italy's had 5,500 people die, 6,000 people, horrific numbers. If it's as bad as there, is Boris toast? What do you think, Michael?
Potentially, yeah. And I mean, I actually don't think it will be as bad as Italy because, I mean, even though, our NHS is at capacity as much as Italy was before they went into this particular crisis, but there was an extent to which coronavirus, took Italy by surprise. And whilst, as we've said on this show, Britain's given the advance warning the British government has had about coronavirus, their response has been shockingly slow. But even though they've had a shockingly slow response, they have had far more warning than Italy. So I feel like we probably won't get to scenes quite as grim as that, but it's possible. What's for sure is that we're going to see an increasing number of preventable deaths. And they will be preventable on two counts. One, because of underinvestment in the NHS over a long period of time, and the idea that efficiency savings are a good idea for public services. So if there's any slack in the system, you should remove it, which is difficult enough in an ordinary winter. That's why you see queues on hospital trolleys, and every time a normal flu goes round, but completely catastrophic when you have an exceptional pandemic like this one. So that I suppose that could shatter one element of Tory ideology. In terms of the Boris Johnson and the Boris Johnson administration, I think the decisions made over the last 3-4 weeks will be quite significant, and especially the fact that the government took a risk by going against the international consensus, and it seems being proven wrong, right? So I think taking a high-risk strategy, which risked a lot of people's lives and which turned out to be the wrong strategy, is very risky for whatever your political stripe. So if there is a public inquiry into this, and especially it will have to be driven by, in the same way that with the Windrush, it's not going to get picked up by the BBC until a separate institution. In the case of the Windrush, it was partly the Guardian, but it was also, organisations like the Runnymede Trust who said we have to push this and make it a story, and you have to force it onto the political agenda. And it could be the same with the decisions that have been made over the last 3 weeks or a month, which is that someone goes through those records, works out that a great injustice was done, and forces it onto the political agenda.
What do you make of the polling for Boris? Because obviously his personal approval ratings are quite high. I don't find that surprising. I think generally the default of the public in a national crisis, you saw it initially actually with regards to the Iraq War, when there was huge national kickback with regards to Britain deploying soldiers. Then for the first few months of them being deployed, it kind of dampened down a bit, and then obviously became a complete clusterfuck and people kicked off again. But the question there, if it's as bad as Italy as Boris toast, I mean, that's kind of at odds with his approval ratings. The number of people who think he's doing a good job is going up. The people who think he's doing a bad job is going down. Those two numbers were quite close, actually, at the turn of the year, despite him winning a general election. It's important to say, actually, for most politicians these days in Western democracies, that's the case. Most politicians don't really have positive approval ratings, generally speaking, whether that's Justin Trudeau or Donald Trump or Boris Johnson until recently. Do you think it's possible that actually Britain could have a very bad crisis with many people passing away, and actually Johnson comes out with it? It's a horrible thing to say, but obviously it's part of political analysis. That's what we're doing. That's why people are watching us right now. He could come out of this with a raised stature, with maybe key advisors being blamed, with the public being blamed. That's clearly one of the major sort of narrative strategies being adopted by the government right now. Do you think that's a possibility?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, I think if this does damage Boris Johnson, it will be in a year's time when decisions that were made now or, over the coming weeks and months come to light. I think because at the moment as well, you've got to recognize that Boris Johnson is now adopting more of a consensus approach when it comes to this particular crisis. So when they were adopting this herd immunity strategy, that did feel like, look, as even some of the right-wing papers had turned against them then, because they were essentially saying, let's let a lot of old people die. And, lots of these old people read those newspapers. So there was an intense pressure on the government to change path. And if they'd kept, on that line, which was out of step with the rest of the international community, I think there would have been real pressure on them, real pressure on advisors, real pressure on even Boris Johnson. But now they've fallen into line with the international consensus. I don't see pressure building up to, cause damage to Boris Johnson during this particular crisis. It might be the case that afterwards certain facts come to light, which are then, which then do some political damage. Also, it's not surprising that Boris Johnson is really high in the opinion polls at the moment. As you say, it's common that in a time of crisis, people rally around the government who are in office. Also, Boris Johnson is giving addresses to the whole public every day at 5, right? And so if you feel like, in a way, it's wrong to call it free advertising, but this is people are seeing Boris Johnson every day on screen being prime minister, and obviously the opposition parties don't have that access at this point in time.
And he's also dishing out lots of money, right? I mean, if you're a small business and he's saying we're going to do this, we're going to put, maybe get rid of business rates for a year or VAT suspended for a quarter, you're only hearing good news, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
That can only last so long. We've got a question here from Alex and Erm. They ask, will Johnson, this is a great question, will Johnson have to ask for a transition period extension? Obviously, the transition period kicked in on January 31st, which is when we technically left the European Union. It elapses in December. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to negotiate a new...
December 31st.
December 31st, before the end of the year. That's right. So it's 11 months to effectively negotiate this new, which was always going to be difficult. But now it seems virtually impossible. What do you think the next couple of months mean for Britain leaving the European Union with a deal after December 31st?
I mean, I assume they're going to have to extend it. And that's not necessarily because, there's no time to come up with a Brexit deal or whatever. But I think that faced with this crisis, if there's any way to claim, and there would be if they tried to sort out Brexit by the end of the year, there's any way to claim that the government were distracted from dealing with coronavirus and that the entire mechanics of the state were not thrown at this particular crisis, I think that could be politically toxic for the government. So if it turns out, as it presumably will, and it seems like the government already have made a bunch of mistakes, if it can be shown that those mistakes were made because there were people in government and in the civil service distracted by Brexit, that's going to be politically toxic for them. I saw is it Matthew Elliott? He's someone who was in Vote Leave with Dominic Cummings, and he was on the Andrew Marceau for a couple of weeks ago. And he was asked about this, and he said, well, I don't think that Michel Barnier and whoever is our top bureaucrat are going to be dealing with coronavirus, so why can't we deal with Brexit? And I mean, it just came across to me as completely out of touch and gross, because what people need to know right now, when the lives of their family members are at risk, and obviously the state is dealing with challenges it hasn't faced in decades, is that every single the entire energies of the state have to be put towards tackling and containing coronavirus. And if it seems like someone's half of the government are off signing a trade deal with the European Union, I just think that's politically untenable.
I'm looking for more questions. There's so many. I think this will be the final one. I really like this. This is from Pieman. Could this be the moment Thatcherism died within the Conservative Party and we go back to a more Macmillan variant of Toryism? I mean, that's something we saw a little bit with the budget. I mean, it feels like a lifetime ago. It was a couple of weeks ago. We saw a little bit of that. But with regards to the response to this crisis, it feels like their hands were tied. They never really had a choice. But guaranteeing, wages for people that work in businesses, guaranteeing lines of credit to businesses, all manner of very extraordinary interventions for a party which is meant to be committed to free market ideology. We talked about it yesterday, for instance. They've socialized the losses for all private rail operators in this country. That's not socialism. That's socializing losses, privatizing gains. But still, it's quite an extraordinary intervention, which is very much anathema to Thatcherite ideology. Do you think this could be that signal moment, that historic moment where the Tory party transforms to something else? I think James Butler put it very well, didn't he? He said, in a time of crisis, everything changes, including your enemies.
No, I think it probably will. And I would imagine that at this point in time also, so, the Tory government up to this point was sort of dealing with these two different demands being placed on it. So one was from, certain sections of the business community who were saying deregulate, deregulate, deregulate. On the other hand, you've got this idea that there is, people in the country, their voters are tired of austerity, and many people want a more interventionist state. And these were, pulling in often opposite directions. At this point in time, one of the long-term impacts of coronavirus could easily be that, globalization slows down a little bit. For one, you're going to have a bunch of states who are saying, maybe if we are reliant on trade, that puts us in a pretty weak situation when it comes to a time of crisis. Obviously, ventilators is the most obvious example here. So I really think that's going to be an example whereby the country, the population really understand and have, concrete political demands that we need industrial capacity in Britain. And I feel like that same political moment will be occurring in many different countries right now. So I think the drivers towards free market globalization in every section of the economy or in every section of society will be weaker than they were before this particular crisis. At the same time, I'm sure, people like Dominic Cummings seems to not be averse to having a strong state. And if one of the challenges for the Johnson government in becoming a bit more interventionist was the resistance they'd faced doing it, then obviously once it's already done in a time of crisis, it's much easier for them to keep the bits they like than it would be for them to introduce them in the first place, right? So if I don't think it wasn't in the Tory manifesto to nationalise the rail, so they probably won't do it. But if just to take that as a hypothetical example, if the Conservative Party had decided 2 months ago they wanted to nationalise the railways, that would have been incredibly difficult. Now they've done it basically in a time of crisis. It's quite easy to not then give them back to the usual franchising system. It's in any way in which elements of the Tory leadership want to maintain control over the economy after this crisis, they can quite easily, keep it. So end of Thatcherism.
You're calling it. You're calling it. Is that what you predict? Is that what you predict, or your expectation, or your hope?
All three.
All three. I think you're right. I think something very significant is going to change, and it's an open-ended question as to which way. But I think the free market element, both domestically and internationally, is probably coming to an end. Michael, you've been fantastic. We're finishing pretty much on the dot tonight. We're back tomorrow. You're hosting, I believe, Michael.
Yep.
Regular viewers.
We'll work out what it's on.
Michael is just a superb host. I think at Novara Media we're gonna hold on to you as long as possible, Michael, before Channel 4 or
Mate, I can't even leave the house, let alone leave Novara Media.
That's true. Well, at least we got you till the end of this. I'll see you tomorrow, and I'll see the rest of you tomorrow. You've been fantastic. This is Novara Media. Tiski Sauer. Good night.